Paul, I'd like to know, how do you explain the great success of your book that is a bestseller all over the world?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy with this success. I'm very happy that my book is now available in Argentina. I think the success of my book comes from the fact that there are many people in many countries who are tired to hear that this is too complicated for them, that economic issues are too complicated. And so my book is, I think, a very accessible book that can be read by anyone. And I think this is contributing in a way to a democratization of economic knowledge, which many people are waiting for. Economists for a long time have tried to pretend that they have a science that is so sophisticated that the rest of the world cannot understand. But of course, this is a big joke. And I think issues of income and wealth and public debt and capital and rate of return and growth rate are not technical. These are not only economic issues, but also political issues, social issues, cultural issues, and this is what I try to show in my book. And I think this is what makes many people, interested in the historical materials that I provide in my book. This is a way to help them to make their own opinion about these very important issues, and I'm very happy about that. I think these are issues that are too important to be left to a small group of economists or experts.
Yes, but let me tell you what I perceive as a paradox. The book is a great success, bestseller, but there is no poll, at least in Argentina, where inequality appears as a top concern for the people. How do you explain that?
A big concern in Argentina and everywhere is unemployment, how the young generation access jobs, good wages, is it possible to access property?
But not inequality.
Well, no, but this is inequality. This is the distribution of income and wealth. So, we should not focalize too much on specific words. I mean, this is a book about the distribution of income and wealth, trying to understand, what forces, what economic, political forces affect the evolution of the distribution of labor income, the distribution of properties, the evolution of the public debt. So I think, in Argentina, I can see that people are very interested about the history of the public debt, and that's a big part of the book. So, we should not focus. Inequality is not a problem in itself. What matters is to have maximum opportunities for the poorest group in societies, and sometimes inequality is excessive, and when you have too much concentration at the top, I think everybody can understand that this is not good for the economy, this is not good for growth, this is not good for the poor. It's it's always a complicated, multidimensional political conflict, the issue of income and wealth and poverty and inequality. I would certainly not say that Argentina is a country where distributional conflict is not important. I think a lot of Argentina's problem with political stability and inflation and development in general have to do with the difficulty to solve distributional conflict. And it's like this in every country. Every country has to solve, in the end, the issue of inequality, the issue of distribution of income and wealth in a way that is acceptable. So the problem is not to bring inequality to an end, to have perfect equality. Everybody understands that perfect equality will not work. The issue is to find arrangements about the proper level of inequality so that people feel that this is fair or acceptable or collectively efficient. And certainly in Argentina, this is a very important issue.
I understand your book as a vindication of politics in economics. Is it right?
Well, I think indeed it would be an illusion to believe that pure economic forces can do the job. When you look at the history of the past century and the history of income and wealth distribution in the past century, you can see that politics is everywhere. And if you try to account what we observe just with pure economic forces, you're not going to go very far. For instance, in European countries, the reason why you have reduction of income inequality between 1910 and 1950 is basically very much related to World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and also, even most importantly, the new social and fiscal policies that were finally accepted by the elite after these shocks and that were refused before the shock. So this is why in my book I try to show that if you want to look at the history of income and wealth, you also need to look at the history of collective beliefs and collective representations of income and wealth in political debates, but also in the literature, which has a very unique, powerful way to express the consequences of money and of inequality in the life of people. Because ultimately these are these representations of inequality which determine the policies and institutions that we choose, and which in turn determines the evolution of economic variables. So there's, economic variables and social and cultural variables are intimately related. Economics is part of the social sciences, and this is what I try to illustrate in my book.
In your book, you argue in favor of a social state, as you call it, and you say that one of the main tools to build a social state is a world progressive tax on capital, with information by the banks where the people has the money. But at the same time, you say that this is an utopia.
In its perfect form, it is an utopia. But I believe in step-by-step progress. So, of course, it's better. The more global cooperation, the better. But we don't need to wait for a perfect global government to start doing something. So there's a lot that can be done at the national level. And indeed, historically, the rise of the social state, has been very much at the national level, and I think it's still possible, for countries like Argentina to improve the working of their fiscal system, to make it less regressive. Consumption tax, indirect tax are more than half of total tax revenue in a country like Argentina or in most Latin American countries, and we could have more reliance on progressive tax on income and property and wealth and inheritance. There's no national inheritance tax in Argentina since 1976. So, we don't need to wait for a global government to change this, because many countries, in the US, in Germany, in Britain, in particular, even countries which are not particularly left-wing, they have a progressive tax on property and inheritance. So there's a lot that can be done at the national level. Now, to do more, we also need to fight tax havens. We also need more financial transparency at the international level, and I think it's possible to make progress in this direction if we take the proper sanctions on those who benefit from financial opacity. We cannot just ask tax havens to stop being tax havens. So we must and make progress in this direction by taking sanctions. But again, I stress that we should not use the lack of progress in this direction as an excuse not to do the fiscal and social reforms that we can do at the national level.
In Argentina, we have the top rate on income ganancias, we call, at 35%. And you argue that the top rate for income tax could be or should be 80, 85, 70, much higher. Do you think that's feasible?
Well, first let's look at the history of progressive taxation. So what we see in history is that a tax rate such as 35%, what you have in Argentina right now for top incomes, is relatively low by historical standards. You can see countries like the United States or Britain, who between 1930 and 1980 had marginal tax rate on very top incomes of 70, 80, 90%. Now, does this mean that we can do the same right now in Argentina? Not necessarily, because probably this would require more financial transparency at the international level, more automatic transmission of information, so that wealthy Argentinians, cannot put their money abroad too easily. Now, even though 70, 80, 90% might be a bit difficult without this extra cooperation, between 35 and 80, there's a lot of space. So I think it would perfectly be possible for Argentina to have a top tax rate on very high incomes of 40, 45, 50, 55. I don't know what the exact number, but I find it quite...
More than 35.
Certainly more than 35. I find it very striking that, we have there is a government in Argentina who cares a lot about distribution and who says to be very progressive, but at the end of the day, there was no major reform of the income tax system. And in fact, the only reform, in a way, in the past 10 years of the income tax system has been to let inflation make people go up into the income brackets. So now you have many more people who are in the 35% brackets than there used to be because of inflation. And it strikes me that this is the wrong way to deal with the tax system. You cannot just let inflation decide. You want to have a clear democratic decision and communication. A political decision. If you want more people who pay the 35% bracket than before, you should explain why. You should come to your population and say, okay, we think we should have more people paying 35%. You should not just let inflation decide.
How much do you think the inheritance tax could contribute to the income of the AFIP, of the fiscal income?
Well, first, this will be a way to reduce other tax. You could have less tax on consumption, indirect tax, if you have more tax on inheritance or property in general. So there's a balance to find. There are three big categories of tax. Tax on consumption, tax on income, tax on wealth and property. And within the category of tax on wealth and property, you have the annual tax on wealth and property, and you have the tax at the time of transmission of wealth, which I think makes a lot of sense because, with the kind of meritocratic values that we all have in mind, I think we should tax labor income less than inheritance. And here we do the opposite.
Suppose I leave $1 million. How much should my family pay as an inheritance tax? 50%, how much?
Well, I think they should pay more than if you get $1 million with your income. So it
more
gives
than
you
35.
Well, probably if you pay. I don't see why. When you make an income of $100,000 or 500 or 1 million in your lifetime. So you have to look on a lifetime basis also. You cannot just compare annual income with a lifetime inheritance. But if during your lifetime you make $1 million in labor income, I don't see why you should pay more tax than if you receive $1 million in your inheritance. I think the opposite probably should happen. And in fact, in most countries, or in many countries, is what you have. Well, it's complicated because it's a mixture of inheritance and property tax, annual property tax. But if you just take the inheritance tax, if you take very different countries like the United States, Germany, Britain, France, it's around 40%, the top rate in all of these countries for very high inheritance. And in addition, you have quite large property tax during your lifetime. So, you don't want to put all the tax at the time of inheritance because you don't know how the value of your property is going to change in the following decade. So probably it makes sense to split the tax burden between the tax on inheritance and the property tax. Anyway, taking everything together, this is very substantial. Now, in Argentina, it is 0% at the national level, which strikes me as very low. So, I'm not saying it should be directly 40%, but starting with 10, 20, in any case, I think it's very important to show to the poor and the middle class how they can benefit in a very concrete manner by introducing a tax like the inheritance tax.
And just to finish, what can you tell us about the meeting you have with Kicillof, Banoli, and the president?
Well, first, I should say that I know too little about Argentina to give lessons to Argentina about, what they should do, etc. I'm trying to learn, and it was very interesting for me to meet Kicillof, to meet Christina Kirchner, to learn about their viewpoint on these very controversial issues about the measurement of inflation. And I don't have a strong view on what's the true inflation rate right now in Argentina, but clearly I think there's a lack of transparency which is not good for the political debate and for the distributional conflict in Argentina. It's always difficult to deal with high inflation, and I'm not blaming the government. That's difficult. I don't have perfect solution, but I think we need more transparency.
Did you talk with them about the transparency, the need of more transparency in the information?
Yeah, I talk about them with this matter. So they told me their viewpoint, which is that it's really the media that is against them, and I'm ready to believe that in some cases the media can be more influenced by the opposition or favored economic groups and the economic groups that the government is trying to defend. So I understand their viewpoint, but at the same time, I think the best way to reply to this kind of criticism about inflation rate measurement is to have more transparency. And so in particular, I asked Kisilov, about better access to fiscal data about income and wealth in Argentina, because for now, we were never able to access the micro level database. At the end, I think governments should not be afraid of transparency, because it is the lack of transparency that generates very tense political conflict and sometimes wrong perceptions about what